All right. Shall we close the door? It always feels more comfortable with the door closed. Then I know people can't sneak out without making a scene. This is the panel devoted.
I gotta go.
Well, you're an editor. You get to do whatever you want. We all know that.
Oh.
All right. This is the panel devoted to the career of the guest of honor here, Gardner Dozois. And I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists myself instead of normally, as we often do, have them introduce themselves. Here we have Greg Feeley, who is known as a writer and also as a critic, and has a large reputation there too, I gather, as a critic, right? Well, all right. Gordon Van Gelder, who is the editor of Some Fantasy and Science Fiction, which should be enough, but he was also for many years an editor at St. Martin's Press. And Michael Swanwick, who is, of course, a leading science fiction writer, and who is also the author of he did Gardner Dozois, in which he interviewed Gardner about every story Gardner had written up to that point. And then Don Keller, who has been very active in both publishing and in fandom, and has been associated with the New York Review of Books and other science fiction, and other noted publications, and who also knew Gardner back in the days when Gardner lived on South Street in Philadelphia, as people sometimes got shot out, only once actually. There was a shooting outside his apartment or near it. And my name is Tom Purdom, and I have been writing science fiction since the late 50s, or selling it since the late 50s. And I have known Gardner since the 70s, when he was a thin guy with long blonde hair, and at Nebula banquets, the women writers would braid his hair.
I remember that.
You remember that, right? And I've also... Since I live in Philly, I've known him for many years in various socially and friendly. And about 20 years ago, I got back to writing short science fiction in the shorter lengths, mostly novelettes. And Gardner ended up buying almost everything I wrote during that period for Asimov. So I would like to start the panel by asking them what do they think are the most noteworthy aspects of Gardner's career. And I will start with Greg.
Okay. I first met Gardner, or first saw him in 1970 at Science Fiction Convention. I was 15 years old, at an age when I went to every science fiction panel I could. The field was small. Anyone who was on a panel was well known to me. I was an omnivorous reader of science fiction. But there was one panel on, Whither the New Wave, or Standing on the Cusp of the 70s, one of these things. And there was someone I'd never seen before. His name was Gardner Dozois. He was very young, 1970, he would have been 23. Rail thin, looked rather like a speed freak in his long straight hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and beard, I believe. And I remember, who is Gardner Dozois? I asked the person sitting next to me, and he said, I believe he's appeared in orbit. Not that I know of, but when I went back home after the convention, in those days, the state of California's well-funded public library system got new hardcovers immediately, and the Orbit 6 was waiting for me. There was a story by Gardner Dozois. To answer your question, what most struck me, and it struck me fairly quickly in the next year and a half, was the relentlessness of his early vision. He had stories in Orbit. Very soon after, I found stories by him in anthologies by David Gerald. He was in the first issue of Robert Silverberg's New Dimensions, and became a regular contributor there. I had a story from Terry Carter's Universe. And the unremitting nature of his bleakness all but burned a hole in the page. It was tremendously impressive in its way. And you don't have to be impressive in everyone's way, or in several ways. It's enough to be impressive in one way, if you're genuinely impressive, and his stories were. We'll come back to things, but I would say the most single thing, and it was evident from the absolute outset of his career, was the laser-sharp focus no backscatter, no wavering of the bleakness of his vision.
Oh, all right, Gordon. And you can talk about him as editor
Well, I
or
was going to
writer,
say,
whatever you
that's the
think.
thing. You know, if I have to pin down one thing in Gardner's career that I consider most significant, you know, as a magazine editor, I really appreciate what Gardner's run at Asimov's, wasn't 20 years, but it was close, right?
19.
Yep. Having said that, though, in the far future, I think people will look back at Gardner for his single biggest accomplishment will be the year's best science fiction volumes that he's edited. He's up to 28 now, is it? Something like that.
28 in that series.
And
He's edited
plus he did
several
the Duck
for
and
Duck.
the,
Yeah,
right.
so he goes back well into the 35
Right.
years or so, yeah.
But I was the editor of those books for 12 years, 10 years, something like that. What he did in those
You mean
books,
the editor
editor,
in-house.
right, the editor at St. Martin's Press for, I don't know, volumes 6 through 16 or somewhere around there. He built the whole center of the field for more than a decade, basically 2 decades now, with those books and held it together. And the achievement and the vision that he's got in those books is just amazing. We can talk about that more later, but I consider that easily his biggest accomplishment out of many.
That's a good point.
Oh. My focus as a science fiction writer is different. Gardner used to have a little table in his living room where he kept all of his awards. And there are all these Hugos thrusting up. It looked like a display in a sex shop. And then there, in the middle of this forest of phalluses, there were these 2 gleaming virginal nebula awards. And that's always been where my focus is. In a way, it's a pity that Gardner had to give up almost entirely his fiction for his editing. I don't see how he could have earned enough to have kept himself alive for more than a decade, so he'd have been long dead by now. But his accomplishments as a writer is just so extraordinary. I think he's a great editor. I think he's one of the important editors in the field. But I value his fiction far more.
I'm basically with Michael on this. You know, nobody can deny how important an editor he has been, both for Asimov's and in the Best of the Year anthologies. That's a tremendous accomplishment. But you know, like Greg Feeley, as a young reader of the field, you know, in the late '60s and early '70s, who had a predilection for the new wave type of story anyway, Gardner's, you know, very focused and, you know, beautifully written stories, you know, bleak as they were, it was just really exhilarating to read those stories.
You know, the funny thing is, I think his bleakest story had to be Drat.
Drat? I don't remember that one.
I'm trying to remember the title.
Eaten by the Sea, Chains of the Sea, Horse of Air.
The one where the young
Might be
girl,
something by Ty from
Oh,
Suicide.
Machines of Loving Grace.
Machines of Loving Grace. Machines of Loving Grace. In brief, there's this young woman, and she's in this really bleak, despairing world, and with great effort, she puts herself where she can't be reached and commits suicide. It's really very painful. And then somewhere across town, a little light goes off on the board, and somebody says, "Oh, geez, it's her again." And then the ambulance comes out, and they pick her up, and they bring her back to life. And they say, you really shouldn't do that. You know, it's very naughty use of the state's resources. And then you put her back in her bleak, despairing life. Now, Gardner thinks this is a positive and upbeat story because she continues to try to commit suicide.
Fight the power!
Exactly. and he says if she had given in and stopped committing suicide, then that would be a bleak story. But this is an affirmation of the human spirit.